Britain has gone gardening mad. Most of us have got the gardening bug, and we now spend more of our hard-earned cash on our gardens than any other nation in Europe. It's the story of how gardening went from this...
Welcome once again to our gardening club.
...and started being like this. Almost without knowing it, we've been through a revolution. One that tells a story of how our lives, as well as our gardens, have changed beyond recognition. So, just how did Britain get the gardening bug? The story starts in 1940, and Britain was at war. Life as we knew it came to a standstill, and while the men were sent off to fight, everyone left back at home was conscripted into their own war effort. The patriotic duty to grow as much veg as we possibly could.
It was the London Evening Standard and a headline on one of their leaders that came up with the Dig for Victory phrase. The government then embraced it, of course, and what they urged us to do was to turn over every piece of available and productive land into vegetable production.
The government issued plenty of information to advise and instruct people how to grow vegetables. Beautiful posters, which are now very collectible, with the Dig for Victory logo emblazoned across it. I think it also was a really important part of the war effort, sort of socially and culturally as well. People felt that they were playing a part.
Across the country, great open public spaces were full of vegetable growing. It was a marvellous endeavour.
There may be room for vegetables on top of your Anderson shelter, or in the backyard, or even on that flat bit of roof.
I mean, Dig for Victory was an incredibly important propaganda moment. People like Potato Pete was this character who was exhorting you to basically to eat him. You know, a sort of cannibalistic, he was like that Bertie Bassett licorice man, in a way.
Put your garden on war service. If you haven't got a garden, go to your local council office and ask for an allotment.
Digging for Victory was a serious business, and coupled with our healthy waste not want not attitude, soon led to Britain's first ever potato peeling patrol.
Dearly beloved brethren, is it not a sin when you peel potatoes to throw away the skin? The skin feeds the pigs feed us. Dearly beloved brethren, is it not thus?
As well as the vegetables, there were things called pig clubs. 6,900 of them, I think. You know, groups of gardeners got together and they bought a pig and they fed off vegetable and kitchen scraps, and then at the end of the day, oik, down into the kitchen, and they shared it amongst the people who reared it.
The black pig is Romeo. The white one, she's Juliet. But so far there's no balcony scene. When they grow a little bigger, well, that'll be another story. A sad one for Romeo and Juliet.
The Dig for Victory campaign grew and grew. Everywhere you looked, people were digging up parks, playing fields, flower beds and lawns. What the nation needed was a gardening guru. And before long, the first gardening celebrity was born. Where else but on the wireless?
Good afternoon.
Well, when we say celebrity...
I suppose one of the most difficult jobs to explain over the wireless is the pruning of fruit trees.
Cecil Middleton was a phenomenon before and during the Second World War. I mean, he started his broadcasting on the wireless in 1931. On the home service, he was getting 3.5 million, eat your heart out, Gardener's World.
My general advice to amateurs is, if you don't know why you're making a certain cut, don't make it at all.
I remember one of his sort of homespun phrases was, "The harder we dig for victory, the sooner the roses will be with us."
For the women left at home, the war effort was seriously hard work. The Women's Land Army mobilised 80,000 of us. Women were suddenly in charge. We may have only been digging up potatoes, but this change paved the way for the emancipation of women in years to come.
I think the Land Army and the work that women did through the Second World War almost put women on an equal basis. They worked machinery, they drove tractors, they did the big heavy work that nobody would have expected of them previously. I think actually it liberated a lot of women. It allowed them to do men's work. And they also played an important role then in the war effort. They became confident. I'm sure a lot of men had a horrible surprise when they came back and found their housewives had turned into these very sturdy, strong, confident women.
Whilst the war affected everyone's lives, it didn't start us gardening as a nation. We Brits already had a grand tradition of gardening, as only a nation who ruled the world could.
I think before the war, even the middle classes would have a jobbing gardener. And so I think a lot of middle class people didn't actually do a lot of gardening themselves.
Before the Second World War, in the interwar years, there were still large gardens, very large gardens with very large forces of gardeners working there, really the Victorian setup, with a head gardener and a strictly hierarchical order of men working under him. The Second World War really caused the end of that system.
Professional gardeners went off to the war to fight, didn't always come back to be gardeners, ended up somewhere else. And also I think deference had taken a great hit during the war.
I think Dig for Victory, did give people a sense, certainly did teach some people how to start vegetable gardening, particularly in the very, very inner city areas. And I think maybe it may have led to an idea that your yard could be used for something else.
You shake my nerves and you rattle my brain. Too much love drives a man insane.
The 1950s came along, and in the face of austerity, we got on with life as best we could, being choked to death by air pollution and surviving on rations. We realised that gardening might actually cheer us up, especially as on Sundays in the 50s, there wasn't a fat lot else to do.
In those days, you couldn't go racing, you couldn't go to football, you couldn't go shopping. And I think for a lot of people, gardening was what you did on a Sunday afternoon.
The earliest recollection of why people did it was because there wasn't a lot of other things to do, and there was a real pride in looking after their front patch. They didn't want to be seen up by their neighbours or anybody else.
After the war, you had all these little houses with little backyards, and what they were really is backyards. It's where you kept the outside loo and where you hung the washing, and it was a purely functional area.
The yard mainly was for storing things like coal and wood and tut, and there was a shed and often a privet, and people would just keep it like that. There wasn't a single back garden in our road that I can remember. They were all little yards.
It's all about plumbing. If you can move the loo inside, then suddenly you've got an area that doesn't smell, and you've got a shed. And that yard then becomes a garden.
The Chelsea Flower Show, which had been cancelled during the war, made a comeback, bringing a bit of glamour into our rather dismal lives and fueling our imaginations. We flocked there in our droves, collecting all sorts of colourful pick-me-ups to take home and plonk into our borders.
I think the people who went to Chelsea at that time, well, really up until recent years, would have been. It was the start of a season, so it was a place to be seen.
Ah, here's Harry Wheatcroft, the rose grower. No show's complete without him.
Yes, Harry Wheatcroft. I can remember a large man with a moustache and maybe a check jacket.
Then come the thousands of visitors, garden lovers, all of them, from every walk of life.
It was a place to take your gardener, perhaps, and order this or that, but really it was a social event rather than a flower show in the way that we know them now.
But on Friday night, the show must come to an end. The gardens are dismantled, and in a few days the huge marquees have disappeared, and there's nothing left but the scars on the turf.
This old house once knew its children, this old house once knew its wife.
One of the big post-war priorities was creating new housing for returning servicemen and their families. Before we knew it, 160,000 prefabs were built, each with its little, and we mean little, plot.
Post-war, a lot of prefabs went up so that people just immediately had somewhere to live. And I think, most people know that those buildings ended up staying up much longer than was originally intended. Imagine again all those years of the war, not having any certainty about home life, and suddenly, even though it was a box, they suddenly had something to call home with a little patch of ground in front.
Since the war, nobody's tried to invade us, which is always helpful if you're being a gardener. If nobody tries to invade us, then you look at the area around your house and you think, yeah, we could make this look prettier.
As I walked home on a summer night, when stars in heaven were shining bright, far away from the footlights' glare, into the sweet and scented air of a quaint old Cornish town.
The garden was used for sitting out when it was sunny. You never thought of going out, I never thought anyhow, of going out and doing anything constructive in the garden, and if it was hot and sunny, you sat out in it. But it wasn't a thing of beauty and a joy forever. Well, it was a thing of beauty, but beauty in your eyes then, not as it is now, an extra room. It was a place where you went when it was hot. I don't think one had many meals outside either. If you wanted a meal outside, you went on a picnic.
Thought I could hear the curious tone of the cornet, clarinet and big trombone, fiddle, cello, big bass drum, bassoon, flute and euphonium. Far away as in a trance I heard the sound of the floral dance.
Well, in gardens in the 1950s, I think there was a division between bits of the garden as there were inside the house. And in a way, if you can think of the front garden as like the front room, that was the sort of showpiece, and perhaps no one really ever went there very much. You'd have a roundel bed with a big shrub in the middle, maybe a fuchsia or something, and then Surfinia petunias or something like that planted out around it in summertime. And then at the back you might have a tiny little square of lawn, which again was very carefully kept. And then it would devolve into vegetables very often. It wasn't really used, for leisure purposes. People weren't having barbecues or, having jacuzzis with built-in stereos in them, things people have nowadays.
Our post-war love of colour was essential in the 50s garden. Livingston daisies, dahlias and roses were all the rage.
What we had in most back gardens in this country was really the style, in a way, which we still have, the basic structure of it. It's a sort of miniaturised version of the arts and crafts style of the early part of the 20th century. So you have features like, for example, crazy paving, which a lot of people laugh about today. 1920s crazy paving was the height of sophistication. Then you have elements like a sundial, for example. That's an absolutely quintessential arts and crafts feature, but you might have that in a suburban back garden as well. Or what about a wishing well? But at the same time, there was this great emphasis, I think, particularly in the early 50s, on bright colour. You look back at gardening books at this time, it's not helped by the fact that colour photography, colour reproduction in books is very smudgy. And you open them up and you get this kind of smudge of red or purple kind of zinging out at you. Of course, it's got something to do with the fact that they've just been through this terrible war and in austerity, there was still rationing, going on.
Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All it takes is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground.
We'd perfected our veg growing skills during the war, but when it came to planting anything ornamental, truth is, most of us were still just learning the ropes.
I think before the war, it was very much a question of people passing on plants. Not a lot of people would have ordered things, not unless they were rather well-to-do. After the war, people started to sort of experiment a little bit with seeds, but it was difficult. I mean, you couldn't walk into a place and see great arrays of seed. You had to get a catalogue. You had to try and find out, what those plants were. How did you find out? You had no websites to visit, no internet, nothing.
I think the catalogues in those days, they were lists of plants with more or less useful descriptions. The second thing is, they expected people to be quite knowledgeable.
If you ordered roses, for instance, you'd just get this bundle of of roots. You still can, of course, and it's one of the most exciting ways to do it. But if you were an inexperienced gardener, you would have wondered, what the hell this was.
I can't remember my mother ever going out to buy plants. She might have bought some seeds.
Come into the garden, Maud, for the blackbat night has flown.
Men and women were back out in the garden together. But who exactly was doing what?
It was still very much a man's prerogative, and it was still very much a question of, a man and his tools. That's how you garden. You're in control. That's what you do.
You can probably generalise that Mum would do the flowers and Dad would do the vegetables, and Dad would also do the lawn as well.
When I was very young, my grandfather, my darling grandfather, I remember his one job was to clip the privet hedge with shears. I can remember that, and my grandmother had to nag him into doing that. I don't think he enjoyed that very much.
1950s Britain had well and truly come down with the gardening bug. The dawning of technology was rocketing us towards a snazzy new automated era. Everything started to go high-tech.
There's an idea that gets about that the garden can be something which can be tamed. It's this sort of ancient battle, if you like, between man, probably do mean man in this case, and nature.
Time-saving gadgets were part of the consumer boom, and the gardening world was no exception.
If the day comes when we can press a button, sit back and let the machine guide itself all round the lawn, then cutting the grass will really be a pleasure.
Sweet, sweet memories you gave me.
In Australia, you always had a lemon tree. And you always remembered the lemon tree because we children were sent to pee on it. We weren't to go into the house if we were outside playing. We had to go and pee on the lemon tree because we believed that the lemon tree somehow appreciated this offering of our essential juices.
In my first garden was a large suburban garden, very neat, mostly laid to lawn, and full of lots of don'ts. Don't go near the pond, you'll drown. Don't walk on the rockery, you'll fall and twist your ankle. Don't kick a ball into the borders.
I had a wee pond, I remember, which was overgrown but had the occasional frog, and a lovely rose at the end of my garden called an albertine, which flowers for about a week, drops all its petals and makes a hell of a mess, and then doesn't do anything for the rest of the year.
After all the years of austerity, we Brits were finally beginning to loosen up a little bit. Flower power had arrived from America, and suddenly it was becoming cool to be British. But gardening wasn't really cool. Not yet, anyway.
Well, I'd love to be able to sit here and say the 1960s saw this incredible unbuttoning of the horticultural world, and we had psychedelic gardens and people on acid trips creating incredible kind of garden worlds with abstract plant material. It wasn't really true. People were still wearing headscarves.
Lots and lots and lots of bright colours, garish colours, mixed colours out there in the borders as well. But I don't think it was a particularly young pastime. The people who were really exploring the 60s in fashion and music, I don't believe for a moment were out gardening.
I grew up in this suburban, almost rural idyll. Because the London suburbs then were much more rural than they are now. And it had all the classic features of an English garden. It had a wonderful lawn, it had great flower beds, it had magnificent trees, it had shrubs. And I was encouraged as a very, very early age to just do a lot of things in the garden. So you'd be picking apples, you'd be cutting the grass, maybe with shears. We had a couple of dogs, we had hamsters that were in the garden, we had lots and lots and lots of cats. I remember the cats were always buried under the hedge.
Modern times called for modern materials in our gardens, and soon people began to offset the floral abundance of it all with that essential forward-looking 1960s material, concrete.
They want something which is cheap and easy and new. And so concrete is the ideal material. Very malleable, very democratic, really. They colour it, blue, pink, orange, fantastic.
And then Mum and Dad decided that we should have our own little paddling pool in the garden. And for 1 week they just set to with spade and shovel with Fiona, my big sister, and dug a paddling pond about a quarter the size of a sort of room, lined it with concrete, and then they filled it with a hose, and that was where for years we would, I suppose, swim.
Get around, I get around, yeah, get around, round, round, I get around, I get around.
Britain didn't just have the gardening bug, we now had the travelling bug. The newfangled package holidays made foreign travel possible for working people, whose only real previous experience of it had been wartime conscription. All of a sudden we were jetting off to sunnier climes, like Spain and Portugal.
The mass movement towards package holidays and foreign travel made a huge difference to the way people looked at their gardens when they got home.
Combined with the nice weather that we have here, should make your holiday a happy one.
So you had elements that had never existed in gardens before, like patios.
For this year I'm off to sunny Spain.
Which is it's a Spanish word, it's a Spanish context, Before that, if you had any kind of hard standing, you'd probably call it a terrace, which was French, or a terrazza, which was Italian. But suddenly, because of Spain, there was this inspiration about bringing living outside much more.
In the 1950s, your herb garden consisted of a few bits of mint and possibly some, parsley. But once you'd been to Mallorca for your holidays, you came back and you thought, there was rosemary and lavender and quite a lot of things that you felt that you wanted to grow in your own garden. People realised that there was a whole world out there that they hadn't come across before. When I was a child, olive oil was something you bought in the chemist. It was something you put in your ears for earache. Nobody cooked with olive oil in those days.
Back at home, new levels of prosperity and shorter working hours of the 1960s meant we had more time and money to spend on our gardens, as much as £100 million a year. And our spending was helped along by a new phenomenon that had started life in America. Where else?
The gardening centre may well do for Scion House what sideshows and lions have done for other historic homes.
We saw the arrival of the garden centre, and again linked to social mobility, people owning cars, they could drive off for a little outing in the afternoon.
One of the things that makes the centre different is that it contains what might be called the first gardening supermarket.
And suddenly this one-stop shop for anything related to the garden, from plants to furniture to barbecues. And it changed everything about how we garden. It changed that need to nurture a plant from a seed or a cutting, because why bother? You could go and buy a mature plant and bring it back and pop it in, and there it was finished.
And it took away the mystery, it took away some of the problems of growing, and it made gardening much more accessible in many ways for people that didn't want to get their hands dirty.
Garden centres were agricultural, and therefore they could sell their own stock on a Sunday. Garden centres were therefore one of the very few places people could go on a Sunday. In early garden centres, we all had the most enormous overflow car parks for Saturdays and particularly Sunday afternoons. Many a garden centre operator would tell you in the 60s and even into the 70s, the most important job he had to do on a Sunday afternoon was to direct the cars to get them into the space available after lunch.
Small plants, big plants. No need to wait for them to grow up nowadays. Just pick them up the size you want, complete with a trolley to cart them off to the car.
We were horticulturalists going into retail, and we knew nothing about retail. We were learning as we went along, and the excitement and the fun of that was tremendous.
Inch by inch, row by row.
Having a good-looking garden was becoming fashionable. Trouble is, it was still a bit too much like hard work. And so our quest for ways of saving labour out in the garden continued, this time in the chemical department.
People used chemicals, sprays, quite freely without any awareness of any impact to the environment or natural balance and so on, because that really wasn't something that people had begun to have any awareness of.
My father, had this long, it was very old-fashioned looking back on it, this sort of pump thing, hand pump, and sort of reek of garden chemicals everywhere.
All of the old-fashioned chemicals, paraquat, DDT, were meant for an instant hit. You sprayed them, whatever the problem was, drop dead instantly. Whereas these days, we've become much more sympathetic to the environment, much more aware. But it was that quick fix that was important in those days. Saved you time.
When you've saved that labour or saved that time, actually it should give you time to do other things in the garden, like, shock horror, enjoy it.
And inch by inch, row by row, someone blessed these seeds I sow. Someone warmed them from below till the rains come tumbling down.
Good afternoon and welcome once again to our gardening club.
Gardening had had us glued to the wireless since the 40s and 50s, so it was only a matter of time before television got its turn, even if it was still black and white, not exactly ideal for flowers. And the person who took the helm was a former parksman, who became such a sensation that most of us remember him to this day.
Do I remember Percy Thrower? What sort of a question is that? We still use Percy Thrower's Gardening Encyclopedia or whatever it's called.
There were very few television programmes about gardening. My hero always has been and always will be Percy Thrower. He looked like a gardener, he talked like a gardener, and that was very much hands-on gardening.
So if you've only got room for one plum tree on a wall, my suggestion is Victoria.
My very earliest memory of gardening on television was Percy Thrower for Magnolias, and it was the only gardening programme, in fact only television programme, I was allowed to watch on television.
Last week in Madeira, we were looking at the canary date palm, the avocado pear with the young fruits on.
Percy was the person that gave you a global appreciation of what was going on. I mean, he went to places like Chelsea, he went to the Southport Flower Show, he brought a new world of horticulture to me.
Now here, I've got a lemon tree in flower.
I would say probably that Percy Thrower was like the uncle that you never had. And he knew it all, but he wore his learning lightly.
As we get into the spring, the summer, and into the autumn, no doubt we shall get green fly.
It always seems to be about pruning things. He was obsessed with pruning.
This one can be cut off there, just above that.
He was quite firm, a little bit strict. He wasn't like the ones nowadays who want to be your best mate. It was all about you should do this or that.
Now, before replanting, peat, garden compost, a little bone meal mixed into the soil, and then planting each piece out.
You were constantly being reminded, that he was the expert. This is when you must do it. This is how you must do it. These are the rules, and you should stick by them.
He never actually does any digging, from what I can remember. He turns up and he looks at an island bed that's got lots of heathers in it, and he goes, here we have, Erica carnea, and here we have this plant and that plant, and he sort of points at them, and then he walks off. But you never see him really getting stuck. And then he goes in the greenhouse and he hangs up his coat, and there's quite a bit of action in the greenhouse. Televisually, it's very staid. These days you look back at it, but that's how television was.
This is the attractive face of Britain, and this is the less attractive.
Those of us who lived in 1960s towns remember that they weren't exactly the greenest places to live in. Our towns needed cheering up, and fortunately 1964 saw the arrival of a new idea that would sort out our forlorn-looking parks and streets for good. Thing is, it wasn't really a British idea at all.
There was a very famous gardener called Roy Hay in the 1960s. He went out on holiday to France, and he could not believe every village and every town, how they took so much pride in everything else. And Roy Hay came back to England and thought, well, why shouldn't we be doing this?
Flowers, gardens, even window boxes.
Add a touch of colour to every kind of district.
Just the 3 words from hell, Britain in bloom. I'm sorry, it should be banned.
Where have all the flowers gone?
You're driving through the countryside, everything is green and beautiful and serene, and you turn a corner into a little village, and it's purple petunias. It's those wagon wheels that they put in the middle of the village, and each spoke is a petunia of a different colour.
Some people think that there's sort of Captain Mannering element, that there's people going around saying, your hanging baskets are not looking good enough. And I think there is a small element of that, but Captain Mannering, of course, is a very English thing.
They go flat out to put flowers on absolutely every surface. And nobody seems to realise that this is so troubling to the eye that it's actually floral chaos.
People are often snooty about Britain in bloom because, again, it's a class thing, because they see it as being really rather common.
For me, the crystallisation of the ghastliness of it all is the hanging basket, which I would shoot down. I would ride roughshod through villages at midnight, shooting down the hanging baskets. They disfigure some of the prettiest buildings in England.
When I come up to London, get on the train at Kemble, which is this fabulous, posh little station. It's where Prince Charles gets the train. It's constantly being referred to as one of Britain's bloomiest stations. And they were decorating it the other day, and to celebrate, they took all the hanging baskets down and put them through the washing machine. But I'd never noticed. Because fuchsia are so repellent in their natural state, I'd always assumed that these hideous, sort of throbbing disco flowers were real, but actually they're not. They're made in China. You could see written underneath it, made in China. And I wonder whether sort of the Britain in Bloom authorities know that Kemble Station has non-real fuchsia.
So much for flowers in our towns, but what about growing veg? Another essential element of the 1960s urban landscape was the good old allotment. Normally located alongside railways and canals, they were still in regular use.
Allotments have a tremendously honourable history. They go back to the Middle Ages. There were patches of ground given to people to be able to sustain themselves and their families.
Your full allotment, I think, is a chain long, which is a cricket wicket. It's 22 yards. And that's a big area.
I've liked allotments not so much because of the plants that grow there, but because of the people who grow them. I like the camaraderie that springs up at allotments. There's a great sense of community there.
Our allotment site was a collection, rather romantically, of ramshackle sheds, bits of greenhouses made out of old windows, polythene, corrugated iron.
There's always an old Joe or an old Fred on the allotment who knows more than anybody else, and everybody else bows to his greater knowledge.
And it was just like heaven. It was just like heaven. When I got that allotment and it was mine, I felt like I belonged to Britain. It was my bit of land, my bit of England.
The 70s were here, and the litany of strikes and blackouts didn't stop us enjoying ourselves. Television was now in colour. Shorter weeks meant leisure was the new buzzword. And when we could actually get petrol, we went out in our cars like never before and drew inspiration for our gardens back at home.
In the 70s, people were sort of out and about much more. They were travelling, they were visiting gardens, they were going off for a Sunday afternoon out in the local countryside.
It's an historical fact that Britain is renowned for its gardens. Over the years, the gardens created have developed a character reflecting the inborn expertise inherent in this country.
And this idea of seeing beautifully kept, beautifully manicured gardens and planting schemes would then be the little catalyst to go home and do something rather special.
It's a place of great beauty and charm in which to spend a relaxing day out with the family. It must also instill in many the desire to return home and emulate what they've seen.
It's very possible that the first time I ever realised what a garden could be like was when I went for the first time to Sissinghurst. And then I realised something about the British, that their true expression of their voluptuousness, their love of pleasure, is not to be found in their conversation or their social relationships, but they garden like sensualists. They garden in the most extraordinary, opulent, mad way.
I suppose there's something that when you see a garden on a big, big scale, it takes your breath away. You've only got to go and see some of those great, great historical gardens to realise that we couldn't possibly do it now.
I think it's very, very profound in the British psyche that the garden that you have is a miniature of the grand garden, the great Cape Bertie Brown or Repton landscape that you visited.
Back in our 70s homes, our passion for gardening was gathering pace. No longer content with just tending our back gardens, we started to use our front gardens for a bit of showing off. They quickly became a way of showing the neighbours how genteel, prosperous and clever we were.
I always think that a front garden is the outside version of a front room. It's a space that's incredibly overformal, totally pointless, and all about showing off. That it's got all the most ornate bits and pieces that you feel makes you look posh. You even get a lot of the cliches, a lot of the devices that most people associate with the National Trust. But in miniature, you get tiny little concrete heraldic beasts either side of a drive. If you can possibly bend your drive, even though it's just that much, just enough to make it really annoying to negotiate in your Datsun Cherry or whatever, but that's gracious to be able to do that rather than just go in a straight line.
Why do you whisper green grass?
The best one was the 70s with the pampas grass, which is supposed to mean that you're swingers, was the idea. If you had pampas grass outside, it means it was definitely worth knocking on the door of an evening clutching a bottle of baby sham.
It's one of those things my stepmother was exceptionally proud of. In fact, I think she would invite people just to see her pampas grass, and she would count the plumes. This year we had 12. We only had 9 last year.
It says a lot about the garden and the garden owner. Pampas grass, very, very, very difficult to eradicate once it's in your garden. The only way of going about it is with a pickaxe and a bonfire, and I do mean that.
More than ever, we loved emulating the grander gardening traditions in our 70s gardens. One of these had enjoyed a huge revival in the stately homes of the 19th century.
Topiary was something that you had a fleet of gardeners doing, and it really demonstrated your supremacy over Mother Nature, because there she is, she's growing you a bush, which is bush-shaped, but actually you are instructing someone to turn it into a peacock. Now, when it all starts going absolutely horribly wrong is when it happens in Swindon, and it's actually the Flying Scotsman.
Men have got a bit of a thing about trimming hedges. They quite enjoy it, getting that perfect level top and the smooth sides. It's the woodwork that they never did. It's that coffee table they never made. It's the shelves they never put up. They can do that in the garden. It actually doesn't require a great deal of talent.
But there is just something about that tiny little pocket handkerchief front garden, and then it's got the entire cast of Alice in Wonderland through the medium of bush.
Another of our little garden crazes in the 1970s also had a long tradition, though these days apparently they're only stylish if they're ironic.
Gnomes and the broad question of gnomology is a sort of vexed question, if you like, in horticultural history, because there's a long and venerable history to gnomes.
A very dear friend, who actually is, I thought had quite a lot of taste, gave me a gnome for Christmas. When people walk up the garden and they see him, you can tell they never quite know what to say. Should I mention the gnome? Is he there as a joke?
We all know the story of the eccentric lord going off and getting Nomenfiguren, as they were called, from Germany, which are table ornaments, very smart, things like Meissen porcelain and so on. But instead he, had an interesting moment and decided to go out and put them in the garden and arrange them around in his grotto.
I absolutely, genuinely like garden gnomes because I think that there's something really comfortingly pretentiousless about them. That they are, you can't get any lower than a garden gnome.
With foreign holidays now taking us as far afield as the Alps and Pyrenees, the alpine look became a signature element of the 70s garden.
You had in the 70s certain signature things. So you have a craze for something like dwarf conifers. Dwarf conifers are the horticultural equivalent of flared trousers nowadays. And if you look at these things, they are so redolent of that particular time and place.
We planned this garden as a geriatric unit, somewhere where as we grew older there would be less and less to do, and yet we should enjoy the colour and the pleasure of it.
Dwarf conifers were the thing, these were the things you should go for, those mixed with heathers, lavish lashings of heathers and lovely conifers in every shape and size and colour.
We were always on the lookout for ways of labour saving in our gardens, and composting had long been one of the most arduous jobs. Soon, pre-mixed compost became available on the market, and our lives got that little bit easier.
Well, for generations, compost making was the sweat of gardening. Yes, there were all manner of books that told you how to do it, how not to do it, how to stop it turning out a mass of black slime, how to make it, useful in the garden. But it was hard work.
A team of experts with the resources of Fison's research organisation at Leamington around them put in a vast amount of work to develop what we now know as Leamington compost.
And then suddenly, the greatest labour-saving device of the lot, you could buy compost in a bag, in the early 70s sometime. This was available through this new breed of garden centre. Now, the fact that the compost you could buy in the bag has got nothing whatsoever to do with the compost that you made yourself. I mean, it's a completely different substance. It's for planting in, it's not for soil improvement, it's not for to give you additional nutrients into your ground. It's just a planting medium, but they called it compost. And people have been muddled up about compost ever since.
Joe MacDonald has no garden, E-I-E-I-O. But did you know, with help from Fison's, he can make things grow with strawberries.
Pre-mixed compost in a bag led to an instant hit, the grow bag. It wasn't only a godsend for those of us who had gardens, it was loved by many people living in flats or on estates who didn't.
For some people who are gardening in quite difficult circumstances, people in tower blocks with just a balcony, for example, it suddenly made it possible for them to have a fully mature garden on the balcony.
Did you put the guard round?
Yes.
Oh, we thought they'd make it look more like a little garden because we love flowers.
They could grow their herbs, they could grow flowers, they could, and they could do that without having to, dump barrow loads of stuff up in the lift.
I've had 17 pounds of tomatoes out of the grow bags, which was amazing, really, for such a small bag to have all those many tomatoes to come out of it.
Another great British gardening institution was now essential viewing on the telly.
If you think back to the 1970s and those vegetable shows, they were extraordinary because there were these monstrous vegetables, quite unlike anything to do with reality. I mean, leeks like that, potatoes like this, onions like that.
There are one or two dishes here which it's difficult to express the joy and pleasure in viewing them.
Most of the men who grew them were complete size queens, and they were desperate to grow something bigger than their mates.
How are you going to express in words the quality?
Almost as if they were Dugum Dunny tribesmen in the hills of New Guinea who, if they didn't grow the biggest yam, would probably not find a wife.
And if you look here, you've got the length, but not the girth.
What is it about vegetable competitions? What is the point of growing something to see how big it can get?
I rather feel here perfection, which has never been reached, is approximately, yes, or apparently...
We're almost there.
There, exactly.
I learnt all the tricks about those vegetables. You grew your leeks in a drain pipe, and you wrapped your celery in newspaper as you earthed it up to keep it lovely and clean.
Oh, what a joy to look at those.
It's always the same. It's always old men. Old men and their marrows. It's a size thing.
Just look at the length of shaft. There's no semblance of a bulbous bottom.
It all gets more and more penile, The longer the leek, the straighter the bean, the huger the onion. Nobody ever suggested tasting them.
And that exhibit of celery I shall carry for the rest of my life.
Thank you. Anticyclones like this one have suddenly become all-important, and they're one of the main reasons why this country is now in one of the worst periods of drought since records began 200 years ago.
You can say that again, Jack. 1976 was the most scorching summer in the UK for ages. Hose pipes were banned, standpipes went up in the street, and out in the garden everything burnt to a crisp.
The drought in 76 was astonishing. I remember coming back from Jamaica and things here were all sort of pale yellow. I mean, the country really did look etiolated. I remember my mum desperately having to save water from the sink to keep her blooms going. And the little rivulet at the end of the garden looked as though it would never come back. I mean, it was really astonishing. It seemed very, very strange and a one-off, but of course it turns out to have been a harbinger of things to come.
There was only one thing for it, the UK's first ever hosepipe ban crack squad.
By driving round the town, in this case Devizes, in a somewhat ostentatious van, the patrolmen hoped to discourage the use of sprinklers and hose pipes without having to bring a prosecution. However, suspiciously wet patches in driveways had to be investigated.
Good morning, Madam. We're from the Wessex Water Authority. I'm sure there's a drought on at the moment, and we're asking consumers to conserve water wherever possible. We've also got a Wessex Water Saver, which you fill up with water and place in your cistern away from any moving parts. Every time you pour the flush, you'll save about 2 pints of water that way.
As the 70s progressed, we were getting more adventurous with our gardens. We realised that they could be as much a place for people as plants.
And today's programme is all about eating out of doors.
The garden was becoming an extension of the house, an outdoor room, somewhere we could enjoy ourselves, or even do a spot of entertaining.
Well, if you're going to have a barbecue, the first thing you need is charcoal. And charcoal comes in two different forms. Loose, like this, which is much easier to light, or briquettes like this.
Before the 70s, and particularly before we all went on foreign travel, nobody had a barbecue in their garden.
And really all you have to do now is wait for 20 minutes.
And that, coupled with the idea of the patio and the outdoor room, the outside room, meant that people did spend, and have continued to spend, a lot more time socialising and eating and just sitting in their gardens.
Oh, that's hot.
I'm really distressed to think that most people regard the garden as an outdoor room rather than the point at which they interact with the natural world. Most people who have a barbecue in the back garden are driving people mad around them for about a mile, I'd say, what with the smell of their cooking and the noise and all the rest of it.
Is it ready?
Certainly is.
We're ready.
Good.
It was when the Barbie came over, wasn't it, really? And so people started Barbieing, and you'd go into shops and people say, are you Barbieing this weekend? Which was a really terribly new thing.
Thank you.
By the 1970s, we had more and more stuff, and our gardens and our houses were smaller, and so therefore more and more of the stuff, including the furniture, had to go outside. Therefore, we got lots of these sort of interesting bits of garden furniture, and we got things like space hoppers, which really improved the look of the garden, and all sorts of very brightly coloured plastic.
Oh, hello. The 1980s came along, and with it a whole load of money. Everything in Britain started going swanky. Our houses, our phones and our gardens.
I think it was Asquith who said a Prime Minister must be a good butcher. Are you a good butcher?
No, I'm not a good butcher, but I've had to learn to carve the joint.
There was quite a lot of money floating around the place. Suddenly people were owning their own houses. As soon as you own your own house, you have a garden that you care about. As soon as you care about it, you want somebody to come and do something with it.
Think power, think shoulder pads, think, Thatcher's come to the throne. So therefore, we want to be able to control our gardens.
Gardening was becoming big business, and we turned out at Chelsea like never before.
If you've got a few £1,000s to spend, then how about a conservatory? Just 9 foot square, and this one costs £3,500. If you've a little more, well, then you can get one a little bigger, perhaps.
With the gardening business expanding, everyone wanted a piece of the action. Even our Uncle Percy had got into hot water with the Beeb just years before for promoting a brand of garden chemical.
And some vegetables too. Grown them yourself?
Well, with the help of ICI Garden Plus. Well, I've had no complaints from this lot so far. Certainly.
Well, I remember the absolute shock when Percy lost his job, and it was from advertising chemicals.
You're the expert. What's wrong with my roses this year? Probably haven't been feeding them right. I always give mine that ICI Rose Plus.
And that was it. The BBC weren't going to tolerate that, and Percy was gone.
With Percy gone, 1980s gardening telly had to go on without him. And it did, in the shape of Jeff Hamilton. Very much the bloke next door, Jeff became the new man of gardening, taking a more hands-on and perhaps less patriarchal approach. He even put a little bit of romance in the garden.
I've just bought this bunch of carnations for my wife for purely romantic reasons.
He was the first high-profile gardener, I believe, who really embraced organic gardening. And I think that at a time when ordinary, normal gardeners were also beginning to get rather anxious about pesticides.
And look what I found. This actually is the caterpillar of an elephant hawk moth, but that, of course, is going back in the garden, and another good reason, I think, for trying to cut the use of chemicals down to a real minimum.
And so I think he caught a public mood.
I'm replacing another disastrous rose down here, and I've already dug the hole, which should be 2 foot square by at least a foot deep.
He not only got his hands dirty, not only told you, he actually did it. You saw him actually doing it. And I think he was the one who drew most people in, to gardening.
Next week, we start building. And throughout the series, we're going to show you how to turn this into this.
But that doesn't look like an uber-modern garden at all. Our 1980s gardens actually went a bit retro. Was it a reaction against all the pinstriped, red-braced, Filofax-clutching, champagne-swilling nonsense that lurked out there in 80s Britain? My guess is, probably.
I think this whole yearning for some sort of cottage garden started in the 80s. It went on right through into the 90s and it's still going strong now. But it was this kind of yearning for something that never really was. I mean, the cottage garden was just an invention of Wordsworth and his sister, really. It had never been like that. But people wanted to create this sort of place filled with flowers and perfume.
In a mews near Knightsbridge, Mrs. Coate gardens on the pavement.
The effect that I'm trying to get is of an English cottage country garden. Colours must be relative, and if they are carefully matched together, the beauty of each one is enhanced.
You also had the cultural influences of things like the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales. You had new romanticism grumbling along in the background. Laura Ashley, you know, that was the big brand of the early 80s. Frilly collars, you know, sort of princess mutton chop sleeves.
This yearning for something stable and glorious and lovely. So we look back into our past. And, you know, do you remember in 1977, the Country Diary of an Edwardian Lady was published? And that went to 8 reprints in just a matter of months. It was this extraordinary hit, and it was this need, this yearning for a golden afternoon of the Edwardian age, and that was reflected in our gardens.
Essential part of any English garden in the 1780s, the 1880s or now the 1980s was the lawn. But being British, we can't just grow a bit of grass and sit on it. We have to make a great big deal of it and obsess about it being perfect. And needless to say, that's very much the domain of men.
When I was a child, the business of starting a lawnmower, you know, with the rope and the wooden bobble on the end of it, you know, and you wrapped it round the whatever it was and pulled, and then it didn't start. I mean, it was a tremendous palaver, and I think women very sensibly kept well away from that.
It's June, okay? The sun is shining. It's a Saturday, you've had a hard week at work, you come back, Saturday morning, how lovely. What do? You go to the shed and you bring out this large, messy, dirty, smelly machine, and you and all that sort of stuff goes on, and you walk up and down and up and down and up and down, making a foul noise, and what you end up with in the end is a pile of stuff that composts very badly and smells of petrol and dog's mess.
It's like men and motors, isn't it? It's like you wash the car and it's got to be immaculate. And the lawn is the same thing. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to do this properly. You know, I'm going to get the book, you know, The Lawn Expert, and I'm going to aerate it and scarify it and weed it and feed it and water it and mow it. And if I'm going to mow it, I've got to have a good mower, haven't I? You know, I've got to have it really sharp. Got to every blade, you know, I've got to sharpen it every winter and change the oil and everything. And it becomes a complete obsession.
Fortunately, someone realised there was a mower that was perfect for women who were sick of waiting for their blokes to go out and mow the lawn. The hover mower, quite literally, took off.
New Flymo DXE, first ever hover mower to cut and collect the grass.
And then suddenly they started to introduce the Flymo and all the rest of it, and they'd have some very attractive lady just swinging it gently around. Well, of course, the lady thought, if she can do it, so can I. It took an awful lot away from the men. They felt totally deflated.
It was okay for a few banks, if you wanted to go up and down a bank and really like that around a few banks, but you couldn't get stripes on it. And actually, if you actually pick up a blade of grass after a hover mower's have a go at it, you'll see it's like really badly cut and it goes a little bit brown on the edges, where you need a really sharp cut with a sharp blade. No, I don't, they're fun to use, but no, I didn't approve.
1980s Britain was expanding. Our towns grew bigger, land got scarcer, and gardens became smaller. Soon our hankering for privacy became a national pastime. We wouldn't want to meet the neighbours, God forbid.
So one of the first jobs we're going to be doing is to show you how to put up a proper fence.
In the good old days of gardening, fences were to lean on and to talk over. Now they're barriers to keep people out.
Now, the very first thing you've got to do when you put up a fence is to sort out your line. Do take care over this. I've known so many disputes between neighbours over an inch of land.
These days, with these high fences, you hardly ever see your neighbour, and I think that is indicative of today's enclosed people. We've lost the sense of community in gardens. We've almost lost the sense of community within neighbourhoods.
That's the other one, exactly right.
I think by the 1980s, this little island vase becomes more and more crowded. More and more people have their own houses and gardens, but they are smaller houses and smaller gardens. So those become little empires, which are fiercely, fiercely protected.
You've got to make sure that this panel is exactly on the same level as that one, and it isn't.
My parents weren't the sort to gossip over the garden wall. It just wasn't done. And the first thing I did when I got my own garden, actually, was to put fencing on top of the walls to make it even higher. I want my space. I want a definite marker where my garden ends and someone else's begins.
And now the same thing down at the bottom. If you can put the hammer down the bottom now, Gay.
Right.
You have this pretense that, in fact, there is a wall, a bit like in the theatre, the third wall. There's a kind of invisible wall, and you don't sort of acknowledge each other beyond that. So I think it's all bound up with our English need for our own space, if you like.
Well, I don't know. I reckon this is enough to put you off gardening for life.
Possibly, Jeff, but you probably never had to sit through this. The UK's first ever daytime television show was in many ways a trailblazer, but maybe not when it came to gardening.
Pebble Mill at 1 was always one of those very bizarre, very guilty pleasures, because it normally we only ever got access to it when we were ill, because there's no way you'd watch Pebble Mill at 1 during the school holidays. But if you were ill and you were lying on the sofa and you're going, yeah, Mum, I'm feeling a little bit better, I might be able to have some lemonade now.
Well, weeds are not the love of gardeners, I can tell you, and we thought we'd have a look at that, because at this time of year there are a number of weed killers that you can use very effectively.
And Peter Seabrook had a tiny little border that was on the windiest corner of the Pebble Mill studios. That he then bore you so rigid for 10 minutes about soil types.
We have weed killers too, which will kill grass and leave everything else behind. Really very clever. But if you are using weed killers, it's quite useful to have the right sort of container, clearly marked.
It was nothing to do with how it looked. It was nothing to do with actually making something that was stunning and there was no reveal. It was all about, well, preparation and,
The 1990s arrived. Our thirst for retail therapy seemed unquenchable, and we wanted everything in an instant.
The 90s were the hangover created by the exuberance and the partying of the 80s. I worked at a tremendously soft spot for the 80s. Can't bear the 90s. 90s, take that and, minimalism.
Garden centres had turned into shopping centres, in which we were spending as much as £4 billion every year. Now you could buy anything you could possibly want, and even one or two things to do with gardening.
Hello.
1990s gardening became something that didn't necessarily mean dirty hands, but it did mean a lot of retail therapy. It meant going shopping, and bringing whatever you chose home in the car, be it plants or furniture, lighting, pots, decorations, wind chimes, anything that you could furnish a house with, you could virtually furnish a garden with.
It is now what is known in the trade as tea and wee. It is a destination in its own right. You can actually get on a coach trip and go to a big garden centre for a cup of tea and a wee. It just goes to show quite how powerful the term gardening is in terms of, retail in this country. If you want to sell anything, just make it sound like gardening, and people feel, oh, right, that's all right then. Gardening's a good, clean, grown-up occupation, which means that I can trust it because it's about horticulture.
Gardener's World was booming as much as gardening itself, and regularly drawing an amazing 6 million viewers. No surprise there, given that it was now hosted by a man whose TV career had started as a trusty expert on Nationwide. He quickly became the nation's favourite and rather fanciable gardener.
Alan Titchmarsh has conquered a series of rather dodgy hairstyles to become the darling of television, really. Sort of everything moved from gardening to chat shows to the whole lot, and the very, very good reason for that is because it's very, very difficult. In fact, I would say that it was near nigh impossible to dislike Alan.
The fork's fairly essential too, and on my soil it's very, very stony. It's easier to dig with than is the spade, but I don't use a big one like this. Not being particularly macho, I go for one of these, the lady's fork.
Alan was already a TV presenter. No one really knew that he was much of a gardener, even though he's a fantastic gardener and studied at Kew and had worked on Amateur Gardening magazine as an editor and stuff. So he had serious, gardening credentials behind that. But then he brought his presenting skills, his clever presenting skills along with it, and sort of a bit of drama and a bit of, light and shade, and really understood television.
They say that one orchid in your buttonhole makes you look $1 million. This huge collection here, the like of which I've never seen before, is worth more than £1 million. Wish I had just one of them.
Alan's always very informative. I take away a lot from the programme, but he also sometimes makes me think as if I'm slightly losing my marbles. Rather than presenting a gardening programme, it's as if he's bringing me a mug of cocoa and my tablet, saying, there you are, dear, you'll be all right.
There was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children, she didn't know what to do. For me, Chelsea Flower Show is all about the gosh factor.
I mean, Alan's pretty sexy. The women love him. Quite a few men love him too. I mean, I've seen Alan, up at Gardeners World Live at the NEC. He's been mobbed by the over 80s.
Leylandii, what should be done about the tree that causes more neighbourhood disputes than any other?
As our concerns for things like privacy and home security grew in the 90s, the boundaries round our gardens reached new heights. Quite literally, thanks to our love affair with the fastest growing conifer on Earth.
Now here's one at a year. That's the baby we saw at the beginning of the show. This is how it looks a year later. This one's 4 years old. And this one's 5. It's the Leylandii's rapid growth and the way it blocks out light that's causing a staggering 17,000 hedge disputes a year.
What it doesn't say on the label, or if it does in very, very, very small letters, it says, P.S. does not stop growing after 3 years.
Obviously, the nurseries and the garden centres pushed this plant because it was easy to propagate and it grew very fast. And people do want hedges that grow fast. They just want it to stop. It just turned into a monster.
A man has been charged with the murder of his neighbour who was shot dead on Friday after a long-running argument over a garden hedge.
One person was even murdered as a result of a dispute over a hedge, appalling stuff.
But now there could be a solution to that monster of suburbia, the Leylandii. New proposals would mean homeowners could get their local council to chop down the trees if neighbours can't sort out the problem themselves.
Local authorities receive several thousand complaints about hedges every year, most involving Leylandii. At the moment, disgruntled neighbours can do little to have them controlled, but the government now plans to give councils new powers to intervene in disputes. For the residents of this quiet corner of the English countryside, the sound of the chainsaws marks a welcome end to a long-fought battle.
Hello, Laurence.
Hello, Dermot, but hopefully our little film will persuade you to come and help us out.
And this is our cottage.
Ooh. Gardening programmes are drugged along doing very worthy things about the earth and what you do with the earth and the plants and how you do seeds and what you do for winter and how you look after your lawn. And then suddenly, bang, Dermot Gavin arrives.
I mean, I love this. I think the bay outside is absolutely beautiful.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
the nicest thing about your house, the view of that.
Yeah.
If I had my way, I'd get rid of all this, actually, if it wasn't...
Don't lean too hard on it.
Yeah.
Homefront was at the time very unusual and still is very unusual because it never had a format to it. Above and beyond, a very simple thing, which was that you had me doing an interior and Dermot doing an outerior. We were working for the same client, we were working for one householder, and it was supposed to be what they say in television is a journey.
But yeah, I just can't wait to get on with it and see what he comes up with. Really excited.
And I want to...
He comes into ordinary, perfectly nice suburban gardens, and he just... Some people say he wrecked them. I don't. I think he just caused revolution in them.
The bottom border has been completely butchered. We were assured that the plants would be dealt with and looked after. And to be honest, it looks like someone's just gone in and just cut the tops off all the plants and pushed it into polythene bags.
He would do things in one way and I'd do them in another way. And there'd be a constant fight going on about who was doing it better because we were always vying for attention.
But how do you feel now that you have finally confronted this whole issue of creating a contemporary garden using a traditional idiom and done it so successfully?
Very happy.
Dermot and I would just say things to see whether we could get away with it, which we often did. We were horribly overindulged. We were fabulously overindulged. I'd go, come on, let's go and have lunch in Venice. And Dermot would go, well, let's go to the National Seed Collection. And we'd all go, yeah.
Sorry, were you expecting a design show?
We did have a constant problem with Dermot's gardens. I mean, one of the classics was when he dug up someone's dead cat.
I wanted to make sure that they hadn't dug up my little Snoopy's grave out there. I did mention it, you know, my cat. It's very sad. Earlier this year, one of my cats died, and we buried her here, actually, underneath the tree here.
That's the worst possible thing happens when she brings in a digger and they're excavating and suddenly there is the dead cat that has been in a beautifully tended grave for the last 15 years or something, and it's just, oh.
So diplomacy is going to be called for.
I think we're going to need to be very diplomatic.
I'm not very good at that, Laurence.
Well, hand in hand with the makeover culture, if you like, and the idea of gardens as an extension of the house, went the idea that improving your garden is money well spent, that it will increase the value of your house. And of course, this was at a time of a great property boom. I remember I was the editor of a magazine at the time. We commissioned a survey from estate agents who were telling us that after the kitchen, the garden was the biggest selling point of any house. So there was an idea that it was an investment to spend the money on your garden. And I think there is definitely an element of truth in that. You know, it does persuade you, as well as the kitchen and the bathroom.
A new millennium dawned, and the world started to wake up to the dangers of global warming. Everything and everyone went green. But there was only so much we could do as individuals, and it slowly dawned on us that, just like 60 years before, sustainability might have to start in our own gardens. So who better to become head boy in this era of environmental angst than a man whose passion for all things organic was infectious? He wasn't a trained gardener. He was an ex-jeweller, no less. But he was built like an oak tree, spoke like he meant it, and he persuaded us to love and cherish our gardens like never before.
Monty carried on the tradition of Gardener's World of taking gardeners on. So, I mean, he was the great composter. He certainly got me composting, if not the whole country. But also the organic thing that Jeff Hamilton had started. You know, Monty took that along.
And here in the Long Borders, we're doing an experiment. We're using just rainwater on this side and just grey water on that side. And we want to compare the effect on pretty much the same plants.
And particularly with wildlife and bringing it into the garden rather than getting rid of it. And I associate Monty very much with that, very much with natural gardening.
Now, if you're a chemical gardener, you can paint the leaves with a glyphosate, but I'm an organic gardener and I wouldn't dream of doing that. I'm going to dig them out.
Monty's got the most wonderful hands. They're sort of almost as if they're tattooed with topsoil. All the middle-aged women in the world have the idea of Monty's earth-stained hands running across their tender parts, used to send thrills through the whole of England on a Friday evening.
Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All it takes is a rake and a hoe.
With Monty to guide us, our new interest in all organic growing and all things green meant that Grow Your Own was the new big thing, and the vegetable plot an essential part of every garden. Suddenly you couldn't get an allotment for love nor money.
I think the resurgence of the passion for allotments comes out of a recognition of modern living, what modern life is about, and people wanting to return to the good old things in life and the things that really mean something.
Eddie.
The camaraderie that comes, and you cannot be on an allotment site and be a loner. It doesn't work.
People who do allotments, they're not made. I don't think they're made, they're born special breed.
Yeah, I think allotment today reflect a really wide cross-section of society. We've got everybody. Sex, religion, age, money, doesn't matter anymore on the allotment site. It's they want to grow.
OK, thank you for attending the meeting. And we're here tonight to discuss the show.
The committee can be a fearsome thing in the allotment movement. The big, well-organised committees have real power.
Yeah, but the actual what time do we have to have the things in for? 12 o'clock, is it?
12 o'clock.
And there are rules about what you can grow, there are rules about how you can grow, how tidy it has to be, how long the grass is allowed to be on the path beside your allotment. There doesn't seem to be a rule about rusty corrugated iron, because there's quite a lot of that on most allotment sites. That seems to get through the net.
They hit the right political agenda. It gives you instant organic food. You know, we're all about to die of starvation because of the recession. It'll sort that out. And it gives you green exercise. And it means that you can look good when you reappear in your office because you have a little bit of grime around your fingers. Very, very cool.
Decades of fashions and trends in gardening had got us into loving our gardens like never before. What's more, garden design was something everyone could now try for themselves. It was affordable and cool to redo your garden, and makeovers soon went properly showbiz.
It's a nightmare. It's that idea that you'll get home, you will open the door and look through, and they've been in your garden while you were away and redesigned it.
Ground Force, the essential makeover program, okay? Open with chirpy band music and lorries running around the place, and you'd end up in this small garden somewhere.
Oh, probably think I'm from a cosmetics firm.
Mrs. Smith decided that what she really wanted to do was to have her garden done over as a surprise for Mr. Smith. So Mr. Smith, they quickly invented some second cousin in Aberdeen, and he was sent off to Aberdeen.
Tommy.
I know one more sugar.
Charlie.
Mrs. Smith welcomed with open arms Alan Titchmarsh, Charlie Dimmock and Tommy Walsh, who would come in and be chirpy, generally.
Crikey. Fine, OK, I've got the solution. Forget the plan, 2 mountain goats. One tethered there, one tethered there. They graze up and down.
Where'd you cut the grass?
And Alan would draw this picture, and they'd say, yeah, we're going to do that. And then it would be all action. Charlie was the one, this extraordinary Daily Mail phenomenon she became, purely because she was sort of short on underwear. There's this girl who was actually very good at doing what she did and building ponds and fountains, and had this sort of pre-Raphaelite hair that cascaded around the place, and then everything sort of swinging in various different directions, and that, more than anything else, got more chaps out of their sheds and into the gardening than and there was a moment, and there probably still is, where she was possibly the most famous person in the whole country.
The householder then comes back at the 11th hour, is lured into the garden, and then suddenly, there it is!
Oh my God.
Oh. Hello, Ian. How nice to see you.
And you.
It's not only completely changed, but there you've got Charlie and Tommy and Alan standing there with a bottle of champagne. Meanwhile, the entire street, the entire cul-de-sac, has come out to be part of the celebration.
Thank you very much.
I didn't see a garden that looked better at the end of the programme than it did at the beginning. All I saw was things that don't belong in a garden.
There was a vocabulary of materials, if you like, in 1990s makeover. There was a great emphasis on ornamental decoration. So mirrors, that sort of thing.
I really like the use of the mirror here. You get double the value from your plants and the illusion that the garden's much longer than it is.
Anybody who puts a mirror in a garden is very cruel. The birds just fly straight into it, bang, and you just end up with these dead sparrows around your feature that has cost a fortune.
Garden furniture, usually kind of spindly geometric, or else Mediterranean, again with a tiley kind of top. The cobalt blue planters, they became the biggest cliche of all. And of course, the water feature.
So the water will pour out of that and the whole thing will get going, and the sound effects and the water effects.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yes, you can. What the hell?
Oh, yes, that's lovely.
No, it's not.
There you go.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's brilliant.
No, it isn't.
I absolutely love it.
No, you don't.
Oh, that's absolutely beautiful.
They're designed for hot places. Water features, moving water is supposed to make the air cooler. That's it's Sintra. It's, Granada. It's about air conditioning. So doing it where it was raining half the time anyway, it's completely pointless.
And it means that designers and presenters and people like that can use sort of nice, soothy, gardeny words like oasis and calm and a refuge from the busyness of the outside world. And that's the sort of nonsense that designers like to talk sometimes.
You've got some decking down. Yippee!
I think there's one thing that is wrong with modern gardens. It's decking. There is no good decking.
1, 2, 3.
I know exactly why people use decking, because it goes in very quickly, yeah? It's very clean and quick to put in. It free drains, so you don't have to start digging excavations and putting in sub-bases and taking all that spoil away. It's sort of quiet, it's warm, and also it's a great weekend DIY project. A 2.4 metre by 3 metre deck, which is exactly the size that, you buy timber from the builders merchants, can go in, we can get it down to a couple of hours in a makeover programme.
There's a moment where gardening on television stopped being nourishing and started being full of E-numbers.
Small Town Gardens was a makeover program, but a proper, serious makeover program. You know, it wasn't just turning up for a couple of days. There was a designer, a proper designer.
So they gave me this godforsaken, ghastly, dank, wet, yucky hovel on a slope in Chippenham to redesign the garden for. And so we did something with sort of rubber and chains that was very slightly on the edge of pervy. I've got quite a lot.
This is starting to look quite kinky.
Of that. The person whose garden it was great, and she said, I want something that nobody else is going to have. So I said, OK, but nobody else had anything like this in Chippenham before.
Karen wanted a radical, unique design, a one-off, and she certainly got that.
And Joe keeps telling me this and reminds me of this case. I basically killed makeover programs, and that was the end. That was about the last makeover program. Suddenly we say, enough makeover already. We've had enough of this. James has murdered it, so I murdered makeover.
Gardening had changed beyond all recognition. In the space of 50 years, it had gone from being a hobby for the retired or eccentric to a national and now fashionable passion. It had become a big part of our lives and was big business. But makeover was dead, we'd wrecked the planet, and perhaps we'd realised that gardens are too important anyway for the quick fix. So where to go from here?
I think what's happened over the last half-century is that people have taken control of their own gardens to a much greater extent. I think it's very democratic. Everybody feels they can do it. Everybody should feel they can do it.
Well, the era we are in, of course, is defined by our ecological angst. And the garden is obviously an ideal interface, if you like. It's where man meets nature, or where the homeowners meet nature. So what we do with our garden is a sort of expression, really, of how we're coping with this ecological conundrum we've faced, and all of this guilt we've got, the sense that it's us who've ruined the planet. So how can we assuage that?
But I think at the same time, there is more and more understanding about how important gardens are in terms of our minds, their therapy.
We're now looking out into the cold, harsh outside world, and it's a scary place again. It's economically buggered. We're worried about the climate. We've got globalized international terrorism. So what on earth are we going to do when we're beset by problems like that? And the answer is garden.
What I'm hoping for is that people stop gardening and let the wilderness take over.
So it's goodbye colour, goodbye decking, goodbye chain-hung pergolas and tumble-down walls and stainless steel this and goodness knows what. And it's back to roses and vegetables and cottagey, wattagey, pargety, pottagey, gravelly, wavelly horticulture, really.